Michael Gallup. That's a name, the new name that seems to be tossed out there for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Pro Football Network said that he makes a lot of sense for them. Quote, in their latest article, quote, the Steelers traded wide receiver Deontay Johnson to the Carolina Panthers earlier this month, leaving them with George Pickens and a host of question marks on their wideout depth chart. Pittsburgh has signed Van Jefferson and Quez Watkins, neither of whom is an inspiring choice as a starting wide receiver. Michael Gallup hasn't been the same player since tearing his ACL in 2022, but has a 1,000-yard campaign in 2019 on his ledger. The 6'1", 200-pounder can give the Steelers more size on the perimeter and wouldn't prevent them from drafting an early round wide receiver. Gallup has drawn free agent interest from the Panthers and Ravens since being released by the Dallas Cowboys in early March. We talked about this a little bit yesterday on the live stream. We're going to dive into it much more today. And I got to say, just right off the bat here, at this point, we're going to talk about a lot of names that don't make sense for the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's the time of year that we're in. It's the end of free agency. Guys are going to pop up. You're going to get veterans that at one time had a lot of potential in the NFL, but right now probably don't hold that same potential or that same ground. Guys that probably make sense for a team in July, but don't make sense for a team right now. That's where the Pittsburgh Steelers stand, and I think that's where Michael Gallup stands with really anybody that he's going to go to. And for the Pittsburgh Steelers as a whole, they probably don't have any offensive signings left outside of a center, maybe, where you're going to look at this and say that's on their radar. That makes sense for them before the NFL draft. If we were talking wide receiver trade, cool. You get that done before the NFL draft because you're all in on making that move and you're ready to make a blockbuster splash and just really amp up the end of this pre-draft period. Right now, if you're looking at free agents, you're talking about Tyler Boyd, you're talking about Michael Gallup, you're talking about Hunter Renfrow, you're talking about Odell Beckham Jr., you're talking about all these veterans who, in July, if the Steelers realize, hey, we need another wide receiver, the wide receivers that we have are not going to work out, then you go and make that move. But in April, you're not going to go make that move because the Steelers are looking at the NFL draft. They're thinking they have options in the NFL draft. They're thinking that there's a possibility that they land a really high draft pick at wide receiver or maybe a mid-round draft pick at wide receiver. Maybe they add 2 wide receivers. Who knows? You're going to go through rookie minicamp and you're going to try to find somebody there who's maybe a sleeper on the radar. You're going to go through all of your much cheaper, much younger options before you go and get a guy that is 400 yards a season and say, hey, that's an addition that I think we should make right now. Michael Gallup might make sense for a team like the Carolina Panthers, who don't really have a bunch of wide receivers and could use a third wide receiver. A team like the Baltimore Ravens, who always are looking to add big bodies to their wide receiver core, who just lost Odell Beckham Jr. and are probably looking to replace him if they're not going with a wide receiver in the NFL draft. Before the Pittsburgh Steelers, they have a bunch of number 3s and number 4s. They have the Van Jefferson and the Quez Watkins and the Calvin Austin, who I think is a sleeper in this mix. And really, Calvin Austin's the biggest reason that you don't go out and you sign these guys. He's the biggest reason that Michael Gallup doesn't make sense for the Pittsburgh Steelers, not because they play the same position, because they don't. They play different positions. But the Steelers are going to hope that Cordero Patterson and Calvin Austin are good enough to be gadget guys and they could utilize them as their number 3 wide receiver. Then you just got to find a number 2. At that point, you don't want Michael Gallup to be your number 4 because Michael Gallup doesn't want to be a number 4. And you're not looking to sign somebody to a $3-4 million deal, which I would imagine that's what Gallup's going to go for, and bring him in here just to sit on your bench all season. Because at that point, you have Van Jefferson, you have Quez Watkins, you have Dez Fitzpatrick, you got Denzel Mims still sitting on your roster. You got who's the Marquez Galloway out of New Orleans. At one point, a phenomenal wide receiver for a season. I mean, you got options to be your last wide receiver. You don't need to go sign somebody who's going to be your last wide receiver, at least this point in free agency. We talked about it yesterday. I want to get your opinion here. You hear Michael Gallup. Am I wrong? Am I saying a bunch of stuff that doesn't make sense? Am I using Calvin Austin the wrong way that I should be using Calvin Austin when trying to make this argument?
No, I think you're on the right track with all of it. I mean, looking back at that report and hearing that report, I agree that right now the Steelers have George Pickens and a bunch of question marks.
Yeah,
But is Michael Gallup not just another question mark? So why
exactly.
bring that in at this stage of the offseason? It doesn't make sense. And also referencing that he had a 1,000-yard season 5 years ago is
Yeah.
not really enticing to me. If I'm looking for somebody that was really good early in their career and has fallen off, I'm looking at somebody who's had a worse situation like a Hunter Renfrow. But again, I don't think the Steelers are in a position right now where they need to go out and get that next receiver on the free agent market with the draft less than a month away. So again, the Michael Gallup thing, we talked about it a little bit yesterday. I know you mentioned that, but it just doesn't make sense to me as an actual viable option for the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Yeah, exactly. You go through let's just read off some stats here. And you got to remember, like, I get it, the CD Lamb thing. That makes some sense. You gotta take that into account that he was never number one. Most times he was probably not even a number two because Amari Cooper was sitting around there. But you go through his stats just throughout his career. And I get it, 2021, he tore his ACL, he only played 9 games. But besides that, it's 500 yards, 1,100 yards, 800 yards, 400 yards, 400 yards, 400 yards. The guy's got 21 touchdown receptions. He's a big body. That's where he should be utilized. It's the red zone, right? That's where you're trying to look at a guy like that to make a lot of sense. I just I don't look at Michael Gallup as an option. I don't look at any free agent wide receiver as an option for the Pittsburgh Steelers right now. I think all of them, and they're all going to get tossed out there because they only have George Pickens and they need a number two, and we'll all admit that they need a number two. But I don't think you're going to toss a name out there in free agency right now that I'm going to sit here and say, oh, that one, I think maybe for the Pittsburgh Steelers. No, if you're going to make a trade, cool, go make a trade. I don't think that makes sense financially, but name wise, talent wise, importance to the offense, that makes way more sense than going out and signing a guy in free agency that is not going to do much for this offense. And that's who Michael Gallup is. Go draft somebody. I think you could get a Michael Gallup talent, the same talent level in the 3rd round of the NFL draft. I think you could go get a Ricky Pearsall or a Roman Wilson or a Lad McConkey and have the same impact, probably more for less money and for a longer time than you would with Michael Gallup. That's where I stand on that one.